The fluorescent lights hummed their endless electric song overhead as Danielle Ross clocked in at 6:53 a.m., her name badge clipped to her scrubs reading simply RN with no indication of the woman beneath it. The parking lot had been empty when she arrived, just the smell of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust from the delivery trucks rumbling past the loading dock. She'd chosen the early shift deliberately, fewer eyes, fewer questions, fewer people who might ask about the scars on her hands or wonder why she flinched at certain sounds. Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah was exactly what she needed, large enough to disappear in, understaffed enough that competence was invisible, and far enough from where she'd been that nobody would think to look. The ER at 6:48 a.m. was the nurses' hospital, before the chaos, before the families and the doctors, before the phone started ringing with admissions. Danielle moved through the unit with the kind of practiced efficiency that came from muscle memory she couldn't erase, even if she'd wanted to. She pulled fresh linens from the supply room, checked the crash cart without being asked, noted that Bay 3's monitor was drifting slightly and flagged it for maintenance. The charge nurse, Janet, glanced up from her computer and nodded once. That was all the acknowledgement Danielle needed. She'd learned to operate in the margins of other people's attention. By 7:15 a.m., she was in Bay 4, changing out the 4 bag for the patient recovering from appendectomy, her hand steady and her movements efficient. She'd learned to be invisible through years of practice, but not the kind taught in nursing school. This was a different kind of invisibility, the kind earned through keeping your head down, doing your work without fanfare, and never, ever drawing attention to yourself. The pair of worn combat boots she kept in her locker downstairs was the only thing that reminded her who she'd been. She didn't look at them. She didn't need to. She felt their weight every single day. Danielle checked the patient's dressing, assessed the wound for any signs of infection, and documented her findings in the electronic medical record with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered, that they could be the difference between catching something early and missing it entirely. The patient was stable. The rhythm was good. Pain was information, and she listened to what bodies told her. It was how she'd survived in Sangin for 2 deployments, reading the smallest shifts in a soldier's breathing, the almost imperceptible tightness in a jaw that meant infection was starting. Now she used those same skills in a hospital in Georgia, reading subtle changes in vital signs that other nurses sometimes overlooked. The intercom crackled at 7:38 a.m. Incoming trauma. ETA for minutes. 38-year-old male, motor vehicle collision, unknown injuries. The unit shifted immediately, that practiced choreography of beds being prepared, equipment checked, teams assembling without needing to be told. Danielle moved to help, her body responding before her mind fully engaged. This was the part she loved about nursing, the part that made her feel alive in a way that nothing else did. Not the recognition, not the accolades, not the rank she'd left behind. Just the work itself. Just helping. But when the ambulance pulled up and the doors burst open, everything changed. The patient on the stretcher was a man in his late 30s, blind eyes fixed on nothing, his right leg badly fractured at the femur. The paramedics were calling out vitals with practiced calm. BP 112/68, stable. Heart rate 88, regular. Pupils blown and non-reactive, likely traumatic blindness, but breathing on his own. No spinal precautions on scene, but we immobilized everything anyway. The team surged around him like water around a stone, and Danielle found herself positioned at his head, her hands already working to ensure the airway stayed clear. And then she heard his voice. "Where am I? Who's there?" She froze for exactly 1/4 of a second, a lifetime in the ER, an eternity in her own chest. "Sacred Heart Hospital, sir. You're safe. You're going to be okay," she said, her voice dropping into the professional register she'd perfected over 18 months of carefully constructed anonymity. But her hands were trembling now. Not from fear. From recognition. Captain Marcus Webb. 3rd Platoon Commander, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Her own son's commanding officer from the deployment to Helmand Province. She'd seen pictures on her son's phone, heard stories at the dinner table before she'd stopped attending family dinners. She'd buried that entire life so completely that she'd almost forgotten it existed. But she hadn't forgotten his voice. The medical team swept him toward the trauma bay, and Danielle moved with them, staying at his head, her hands automatically doing what they'd been trained to do, assessing, checking, ensuring. She could feel the weight of it pressing on her chest, the fact that he was here, that she could help him, that she absolutely could not let anyone know why this patient mattered to her on a level that went far beyond professional concern. Dr. Sterling arrived in the trauma bay at 7:44 a.m., his presence announced by the sudden shift in air pressure as he pushed through the doors. He was tall, immaculately dressed despite the early hour, with the kind of careful grooming that spoke of someone who understood that appearance was a form of power. His eyes moved across the patient, across the team, and then across Danielle, and something in that gaze made her blood run cold in a way that had nothing to do with the trauma unfolding on the stretcher. He watched her for 3 full seconds. Long enough for her to know he'd noticed. Long enough for her to realize something about the way she was working, something in her focus, her precision, her obvious personal investment in this particular patient had registered as noteworthy. In a hospital, noteworthy was dangerous. Noteworthy meant questions. Noteworthy meant attention. Noteworthy meant exposure. What's the story? Sterling's voice cut through the controlled chaos like a scalpel. Motor vehicle collision, approximately 40 minutes ago, one of the paramedics reported. Significant head trauma, bilateral fractures of the lower extremities, possible internal bleeding. He's been unconscious twice since we picked him up. Sterling moved closer to the patient, his movements precise and professional, but his eyes kept drifting back to Danielle. She could feel the weight of his gaze the way she'd felt the weight of IED triggers in Sangin, a sixth sense that told her something was very wrong, that she needed to move carefully, that one mistake could detonate everything she'd carefully constructed. She kept her face neutral. She kept her hand steady. She did not meet his eyes. But Sterling had already begun calculating, and she could see it happening behind his expression. The way he was putting pieces together. A nurse who'd immediately recognized a patient. A nurse who moved with military precision. A nurse who was suddenly very, very interesting to him, which meant she'd become a liability. The room went dead silent, except for the monitors and the steady sound of the ventilator that would soon be keeping Captain Marcus Webb alive. The silence in Captain Webb's room stretched like a held breath. Danielle reached for the fall line with practiced efficiency, her hand steady as she assessed the flow rate. The saline was running clear. Everything was calibrated. Everything was correct. Stop. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the monitor's steady beeping. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Just stop right there. Danielle's fingers froze an inch from the catheter. She did not turn around. She did not flinch. Sterling stepped into the room with the posture of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His shoes clicked against the tile, expensive Italian leather, probably $400 minimum. Captain Webb's daughter, Sarah, looked up from her father's bedside. The blind veteran's head tilted slightly, tracking sound, his sightless eyes pointing toward the voice. Do you have any idea what you're doing? Sterling's tone carried the weight of institutional authority, the kind that made residents nervous and nurses careful. Because looking at this setup, I'm genuinely questioning your basic competence. The words hung in the air like a toxin. Danielle's jaw tightened for exactly one breath. Then she released it. The 4 is patent, doctor. Flow rate is appropriate for his current fluid status. Her voice came out level, professional, stripped of any defensive edge. Saline is isotonic. No air in the line. I'm not asking for your assessment, nurse. Sterling moved closer, deliberately positioning himself between Danielle and Captain Webb's daughter. I'm asking how you managed to work in this hospital for any length of time with this level of basic incompetence. Do you understand for mechanics at all, or did you just luck into that certification? Sarah's eyes widened. Captain Webb's hand clenched the bed rail. Danielle set down the 4 tubing with deliberate care. She turned to face Sterling, and when she spoke, her voice dropped to something quieter, something that made the air pressure in the room shift. It carried the weight of 18 years of held-back authority of a woman who had held dying soldiers and made split-second decisions that meant the difference between someone coming home and coming home in a flag-folded box. "Sir, I've held dying men with more courage than you'll ever possess." The room went still. Not the silence of peace. The silence of a fault line cracking. Sterling's face flushed. His mouth opened, then closed. He was not accustomed to being answered. More importantly, he was not accustomed to being answered correctly. He turned on his heel and walked out, but not before his eyes landed on something Danielle had not noticed, a flash of worn leather just visible at the edge of her scrub pocket. The pair of combat boots she carried with her always, tucked in her locker, occasionally transferred when she changed clothes. A photograph of a memory she could not afford to keep alive any other way. For a moment, Sterling's expression changed. Recognition flickered. Then it hardened into something far more dangerous than anger. Danielle adjusted Captain Webb's pillow and checked his monitor readings one more time. She did not look at Sarah. She did not acknowledge what had just happened. She simply worked, because that was what she did. That was all she allowed herself to do. But that wasn't the worst part. The break room at Sacred Heart existed in a fluorescent limbo between the controlled chaos of the ER and the administrative offices upstairs. It smelled of burnt coffee and the ghost of 100 microwaved lunches. Danielle sat at the corner table with her hands wrapped around a mug of herbal tea, a peppermint, which she had brought from home because the hospital tea tasted like hot water and regret. Two nurses sat at the opposite end of the room. One of them looked up, saw Danielle, then nudged her colleague. They both rose without speaking and relocated to the hallway, their conversation resuming the moment they stepped through the door. It was a small thing. Almost invisible. The kind of social geometry that most people wouldn't even register consciously. But Danielle had spent 23 years reading threat patterns, reading rooms, reading the microscopic shifts in group dynamics that meant survival or death. She understood exactly what this was. Dr. Sterling had sent a message. Not in words. In action. She was a liability. She was untouchable. And everyone was going to act like she did not exist. Over the next 6 hours, the pattern repeated. The surgical team's head nurse, Patricia, had always nodded when Danielle passed. Tonight she looked through her. A respiratory tech who had asked Danielle for advice 3 days ago about his daughter's asthma inhaler turned away when she approached. The charge nurse reassigned her to rooms at the far end of the unit, isolation disguised as scheduling. Danielle accepted it. She changed fours, monitored vitals, documented everything with meticulous precision. Her hands moved on their own. Her face remained composed. But in her chest, something compressed, not fear, not anger, but recognition. She had felt this before. It was the moment before everything fractured. At 11:53 p.m., she found the write-up on the unit board. The letter was printed on official hospital letterhead, sealed in a plastic cover, and initialed by Dr. Sterling himself. The words were crafted with care, legal care, the kind that meant someone had reviewed them with institutional protection in mind. Unprofessional conduct. Boundary violations with attending physician. Insubordination. Failure to recognize scope of practice limitations. It did not mention the four. It did not mention her response. It mentioned nothing that could be verified or defended because that was not the point. The point was the label. The point was the public record. The point was making sure that everyone who read that letter understood one thing: Danielle Ross was a problem. She read it once. Then she read it again. And then she did something she rarely allowed herself to do. She let her hand move to her pocket, to the worn leather of those combat boots, scaled down, preserved, a talisman from a life she had supposedly left behind. Her fingers lingered there for exactly 4 seconds. Then she released it. The ER was quiet at 2:13 a.m. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made experienced nurses nervous because emergency departments were never truly quiet. Danielle restocked the crash cart in Bay 3, checking each drawer with systematic attention. Ambubag. Laryngoscope. Size 4.0 endotracheal tube. Epinephrine. Every medication, every piece of equipment, exactly where it needed to be. That was when the ambulance radio crackled to life. Sacred Heart ER, we have incoming. Multi-vehicle collision on I-95 northbound, mile marker 47. Multiple trauma patients en route. ETA 8 minutes. We have one patient with compound femur fracture, one with probable pneumothorax, and one unresponsive with significant head trauma. The ER erupted. Sterling was in the hallway within seconds, already barking orders. Get me 2 trauma bays prepped. I want labs drawn before they arrive. Type and cross for all 3 patients. His voice carried the confidence of a man who had seen emergency responses 1,000 times before, which was exactly the problem. Confidence without competence was a lethal combination. Danielle moved with everyone else, setting up monitors, pulling intubation trays, checking oxygen lines. The choreography of crisis was the same everywhere. Some things transcended hospitals and battlefields. The need to prepare, to be ready, to have everything positioned for the moment when seconds became the difference between a patient leaving under their own power and leaving in a body bag. The first ambulance arrived at 2:21 a.m. They wheeled in a man with a femur fracture so severe the bone had penetrated the skin. His leg was wrapped in a tourniquet, blood already seeping through the gauze. He was pale, breathing in shallow gasps. Sterling took one look at the leg and immediately started orders. Get him to CT. I want to know the full extent of that bleed. But CT was 9 minutes away. The patient's blood pressure was dropping. Danielle could see it on the monitor, 94/61 and falling. The tourniquet was working, but it was a temporary solution to a problem that required surgical intervention. We need vascular, she said quietly. Sterling ignored her. The second ambulance brought in Captain Marcus Webb. His breathing was labored, each inhalation a struggle. His chest heaved with the effort. The paramedics had him on oxygen, but his oxygen saturation was 84 and the monitor showed his respiratory rate at 28, far too fast, far too desperate. Tension pneumothorax, one of the paramedics said to Sterling. We attempted a needle decompression in the field but the patient deteriorated. We're suspecting a second-side tension pneumothorax that wasn't treated initially. Sterling nodded, already moving. Get him on a monitor. Start a large bore 4. We need a chest tube. 2 4s, Danielle said. 14 gauge minimum. He's going to need rapid infusion capability. Sterling shot her a look that could have cut glass. I'm aware of what a pneumothorax patient requires. Please stick to nursing duties. He said it quietly enough that only she could hear. But the message was clear. Stay out of the way. You do not belong here. Captain Webb's oxygen saturation dropped to 78. Then 72. The mechanical ventilator beside his bed hummed with readiness, but Sterling had not yet ordered intubation. He was standing at the bedside, assessing, waiting, doing what he believed was the correct clinical decision. Observation. Restraint. The kind of conservative approach that looked good in a case review if it worked. And it was absolutely, catastrophically wrong. Danielle watched the monitors. She watched Captain Webb's color deepen to something gray. She watched his chest wall efforts become increasingly frantic, his muscles working overtime to move air into lungs that were collapsing around expanding air pockets. Tension pneumothorax did not give you time to be thoughtful. Tension pneumothorax killed you in minutes if you were unlucky. She had learned that in Sangin in 2011. The memory hit her without warning, not as thought but as sensation. The sound of a helicopter rotor outside the FOB morphed into the sound of mortar fire. The smell of the hospital's antiseptic became the acrid dust of the desert. The hiss of oxygen running through tubing became the hiss of air escaping from a collapsed lung. A Marine named Corporal Russo, 19 years old, his eyes wide with panic as his oxygen saturation dropped and dropped and she blinked. The desert was gone. The ER was there, fully illuminated in harsh fluorescent light, and Captain Webb was dying in real time with 12 people watching. Her hands moved before her conscious mind caught up. She was at the supply cart. She had a 14-gauge angiocath needle in her grip. She was moving toward Captain Webb's chest wall, her fingers already identifying the landmarks, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the precise location where the needle would go in and the pressure would release and the oxygen saturation would climb. "What are you doing?" Sterling's voice came from across the room, but it sounded very far away. "Step away from that patient. Now." Danielle did not stop. Her other hand was already positioned on Webb's ribs, feeling for the anatomy, her training moving through muscle memory so ancient it predated conscious thought. The needle went in. The catheter advanced. And then, the sound every doctor in that room was trained to pray for but rarely heard outside textbooks, the distinctive hiss of air escaping, the pneumothorax decompressing, the immediate release of pressure that had been crushing a man's lungs. Webb's oxygen saturation jumped from 71 to 79 to 87 in less than 10 seconds. The room went absolutely silent except for the monitor, which beeped its steady, glorious rhythm. Danielle stepped back and returned the needle to the sharps container. She adjusted Webb's oxygen tubing and documented the procedure in the chart with a hand that did not shake. She did not make eye contact with Sterling. She did not acknowledge what had just happened. She simply worked. But everything had changed. And she had no idea what was about to be set in motion. 5 hours into the overnight shift, Captain Webb's breathing changed. Danielle heard it before she saw it, that shallow, panicked rasp of a man whose lungs were collapsing inward. She was 30 feet away, restocking the supply cart on Unit 3, when her body registered the sound. Muscle memory didn't wait for permission. She moved. The monitor showed what she already knew. Oxygen saturation dropping like a stone. 94. 90. 86. His heart rate compensating, climbing past 120, each beat a desperate attempt to push enough oxygen through failing lungs. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsing the right lung, pushing his heart sideways, crushing the vessels that kept him alive. The textbook called it a medical emergency. Danielle called it a Sunday afternoon in Sangin. "He's crashing," she said into the intercom. Not a question. A statement. The night resident, Dr. Chen, arrived within 90 seconds. Young. Competent. Frozen. He stood at the foot of the bed, reading the monitor, reading the patient, and doing nothing. Danielle watched his hand clench and unclench. The paralysis of someone who had read the protocol but never lived it. Captain Webb's skin was turning grey. Lips darker than they should be. His blind eyes moving behind closed lids as his brain recognized what his body already knew, he was suffocating. "We need a chest tube," Chen whispered. "No time," Danielle said. The voice that came out wasn't the voice of the anonymous nurse from Unit 3. It was lower. Colder. It was the voice of someone who had held men together with her hands while bullets screamed overhead. Needle decompression. Now. She was already moving toward the crash cart. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Her fingers found it without hesitation, muscle memory taking over, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this in darkness, in rain, with men screaming and the smell of copper and diesel fuel choking the air. She didn't think. Thinking slowed you down. Thinking got people killed. "Get me an 18-gauge for a follow-up," she told Chen. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The room had fallen quiet. Not the silence of peace. The silence of witnesses. 2 residents. A nursing student. The monitor still screaming its alarms. 82. 79. The numbers that meant the window was closing. Danielle's hands found the landmarks on Webb's chest without instruction. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. The exact geography of a man's ribs, a man's lungs, a man's survival. She'd memorized this on corpses in the field hospital. She'd memorized this on living men who didn't have time to be afraid. Her finger found the spot. Right there. The space between life and death. She didn't hesitate. The needle went in. The hiss came immediately, a sharp, surgical sound, the sound of catastrophe reversing itself, air escaping from where it should never have been, pressure equalizing, physics saving a life that chemistry alone couldn't fix. Chen gasped. The student nurse made a small sound that might have been prayer or shock or both. The monitor responded first. 75. Breath moving back into Captain Webb's body, his chest rising, his lungs expanding, his heart beginning to slow from its frantic sprint. 82. The color was returning to his face. Gray became tan. His body was remembering how to breathe. 88. She threaded the 18 gauge, securing the needle with the economy of motion that comes from having done this 100 times in worse conditions. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. She was somewhere else entirely, not in Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah, but in a firefight, in a medevac, in the place where training and survival intersected, and there was no room for doubt. 92. Stable, she said. Stable. Like the word itself could anchor him to the world. The silence in the room lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Chen exhaled. Actually exhaled, like he'd been holding his breath since the moment Webb's oxygen dropped below 90. The nursing student was staring at her hands. At Danielle's hands. At the needle. At the certainty that had moved through this room like nothing the resident had ever witnessed in his training. How did you? Chen started. Triage protocol. High casualty scenarios. The words came out before she could stop them. Military jargon. Medical jargon for the specific kind of hell that only existed in 2 places, combat zones and her nightmares. The resident's eyes narrowed. Not suspicious yet. Curious. The first tiny thread of a question he didn't know how to ask. Danielle was already checking the 4 placement, the pulse ox, the blood pressure cuff. All the small movements that filled space, that kept hands busy, that prevented anyone from looking at her face too closely. But it was too late. Chen had seen something. Some piece of her that didn't fit in the story she'd constructed, just a nurse, just someone helping, just a quiet woman in scrubs with no past and no ambition. I've handled a lot of critical patients, she said. Not quite a lie. Not quite the truth either. The door opened. Dr. Sterling stood in the threshold. His eyes moved from Captain Webb to the monitor to Danielle, and something in his expression shifted. Not gratitude. Not respect. Recognition. The look a hunter gives when he realizes the prey has teeth. What happened here? His voice was calm. That was the worst part. The calmness. Tension pneumothorax, Chen said, his voice carrying that note of deference that residents learned in their first month. Senior Chief, the nurse performed an emergency needle decompression. The words hung in the air like a mistake. Like something that couldn't be taken back. Sterling's eyes locked on Danielle's. She didn't flinch. She didn't blink. She simply looked back, knowing that he was calculating something, that the gears in his mind were turning toward a problem he hadn't anticipated, a nurse with skills she shouldn't have, knowledge she shouldn't possess, competence that didn't fit the narrative of the person he'd been systematically dismantling for the past 18 hours. We'll discuss this, Sterling said quietly. Finish the stabilization. Then come find me. He left. But the room didn't settle. The energy had changed. The mystery was loose. And Danielle understood, with the clarity that came from years of tactical training, that something had shifted beneath the surface of Sacred Heart Hospital. She had exposed herself. She had saved a life. And in that moment, she had made herself far more dangerous to Dr. Sterling than she had ever been as an anonymous nurse pushing a medication cart. Captain Webb's breathing was still steady. 94% oxygen saturation, holding. His vital signs were stabilizing. His life was no longer measured in minutes. But hers had just been measured in exactly one revelation. And in that silence, the monitor beeping its steady rhythm, the fluorescent lights buzzing their mechanical song, the world continuing on as if a battlefield medic hadn't just walked out of her own grave, Danielle understood that the worst part of her past had just walked back into the light. The monitor's steady beep filled the silence as Dr. Sterling moved through the hospital corridors like a man suddenly aware of how much he had to lose. His face had gone pale during those final seconds when Danielle's hands moved with precision that belonged nowhere near a bedside chart. Muscle memory. Combat training. Everything he'd worked to keep compartmentalized was now bleeding through in front of witnesses. By 3:22 a.m., he was making calls. The first went to Richard Bancroft, chief of the hospital board, a man who'd approved Sterling's aggressive billing initiatives in exchange for consulting fees that never quite appeared on the official ledger. "We have a situation," Sterling said into the darkness of his office, his voice steady but his fingers drumming against his desk like a soldier counting down something. "The nurse from earlier. Danielle Ross. She's not who she claims to be." Bancroft's voice came back cautious. "What do you mean, not who she claims?" "Military background. Undisclosed. Possibly classified. She performed procedures she shouldn't know how to perform. It's a liability exposure." Sterling let that hang for a moment. He was building a narrative now, the same way he'd built his fraud scheme, carefully, with just enough truth wrapped around the lies. "I need her gone before she becomes a problem. Can you make some calls?" "I'll handle it," Bancroft said. By 4:07 a.m., hospital investigators were being roused from their beds with promises of overtime. Sterling had told them Danielle's credentials needed immediate review, suspicious gaps in her work history, incomplete references, a name change after marriage that wasn't fully documented. Nothing illegal yet. Just questions. Just enough to create the appearance of legitimate concern. He'd learned long ago that the best lies look like procedure. The next morning, a woman named Caroline Hayes from the hospital's credentialing department found Danielle in the supply room restocking for bags. Caroline's face carried the particular discomfort of someone who'd been given marching orders and didn't enjoy delivering them. "We need to talk about your employment file," Caroline said quietly, closing the door behind her. "There are discrepancies." Danielle continued working, hands moving with steady precision. "What kind of discrepancies?" "Your references are sparse. The previous employers you listed, 2 of them are no longer in business. We can't verify your work history beyond the last 4 years." Caroline pulled out a folder, her eyes avoiding Danielle's directly. "And we've had some concerns raised about your scope of practice. Specific incidents where you may have exceeded your nursing certification." "I was assisting a patient in crisis," Danielle said. Her voice came out level, the kind of calm that belonged to someone who'd made peace with a problem long ago. "That's what Dr. Sterling says is concerning. He's suggesting that your actions in Captain Webb's room constituted a violation of protocol. And now we need to understand your actual background before we can proceed with any investigation." Caroline opened the folder. "Where exactly did you work before Sacred Heart?" Danielle set down the 4 bag. She turned to face Caroline fully, and in that moment, the fluorescent lights casting everything in institutional white, the smell of antiseptic sharp enough to burn, she made a choice. She could tell the truth. She could say the words, 12 years, Special Forces, 3 deployments, Sangin, and everything that came after. She could let it all collapse right here. "I think you should speak with Dr. Sterling about your concerns," Danielle said instead. "I'm not the right person to answer those questions." It wasn't an admission. It wasn't a denial. It was a wall. By noon, Sterling had escalated. He brought in 2 outside investigators from the hospital's credentialing firm, expensive men in pressed shirts who carried the weight of institutional authority. They wanted to review her files, her certifications, her background check from higher date. They wanted to know about the name change. They wanted to know about the gaps. "Your nursing license is valid," One of them said, but there are questions about how you obtained the experience hours listed on your initial application. These employers, he tapped a list, some of them don't have records of you. Then I can't have worked there, Danielle said. She was sitting across from them in a small office off the administrative wing, the kind of room designed to feel neutral and instead felt like an interrogation cell. Your records are incomplete. Or yours are, the investigator said flatly. We're going to need to speak with Dr. Sterling about potential fraudulent credentialing. This could result in disciplinary action up to and including termination of your nursing license. The words hung there. Termination. License. Everything she'd rebuilt over 4 years of invisibility. I understand, Danielle said. That evening, before her shift, Sterling found her in the locker room. He was alone with her, and his voice came quiet, almost conversational. I'm trying to figure out who you really are, he said. And I don't think you want me to succeed. So here's what I'm offering, resign today, and we can say this was a mutual decision. References stay clean. Your license stays intact. You walk away, and nobody digs any deeper. Danielle was pulling on her scrubs, muscle memory from 1,000 shifts moving her through the motions. She turned to look at him, really look at him, and saw a man who understood exactly how much power he held. He held her career. Her ability to help people. Her invisibility. I'm not resigning, she said. Her voice sounded like it came from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere older. Do what you need to do. Sterling's face hardened. You don't want to push this. I need to be here tonight, Danielle said. She was thinking of Captain Webb, 3 floors up, still in the ICU, still blind, still depending on doctors who didn't care if he lived or died as long as the billing codes justified the attention. Captain Webb needs someone watching his care. Captain Webb isn't your responsibility, Sterling said. And after tonight, you won't have a license to be anyone's responsibility. I can make that happen with one phone call. She didn't respond. She finished dressing and walked past him toward the door. That night, Danielle worked her shift with the precision of someone operating on a timer that only she could hear. She checked Captain Webb's vitals at 19:06, 20:38, and 21:51. She watched the specialists Sterling had called in, 6 of them now, all of them convinced they owed him something, all of them reluctant to provide anything more than minimal care. The blind veteran was deteriorating, infection spreading through his bloodstream, and nobody was moving fast enough to stop it. By the time she clocked out at 23:41, she knew they'd fired her. Sterling would have made the calls. Bancroft would have approved it. By morning, there would be paperwork. She drove to Bonaventure Cemetery in her 2008 Honda Civic, the kind of car that didn't draw attention, paid for with 4 years of careful nursing shifts. The rain started before she got there, not a gentle rain but something that felt like indictment, cold and relentless. Tom's grave was in the older section, under a live oak that dripped Spanish moss like grief itself had learned to be visible. She'd come here 4 times in 4 years. The first time after she'd buried his ashes. The second and third times without any clear reason. The 4th time was now. She knelt in the mud, her scrubs soaking through at the knees, and reached into her locker bag. The combat boots were still there, the pair Tom had worn in Sangin, the one she'd carried out when the medevac came for her. She'd kept them in a plastic bag under her civilian clothes for 4 years. Hidden. Like everything else. I tried to save him, she whispered to the grave, to the rain, to the ghost of the man who died in a car accident while she was running from her own ghosts. I tried to stay invisible and just help one more person, but I failed again. The rain fell harder. It dripped from her hair, ran down her neck, soaked into the waistband of her scrubs. She was kneeling in mud at midnight in a cemetery, holding her dead husband's combat boots, and the weight of every choice she'd made, every year in Sangin, every death she couldn't prevent, every person she'd walked away from to avoid hurting them, was pressing down on her chest like a hand. Maybe Sterling was right. Maybe she wasn't qualified to be a nurse. Maybe she should have told someone. Maybe she should have let the system handle Captain Webb instead of stepping in, exposing herself, breaking the careful architecture of her disappearance. Her phone was in her pocket. The screen showed 014. She could call her son right now. She could tell him where she was. She could say the word she'd been running from for 4 years, "I'm alive, I'm here, I'm your mother." She almost threw the boots away. Her hand came up, the plastic bag swinging in the rain-soaked darkness, and she almost released them into the mud and let them sink into the earth next to Tom. Let them stay buried. Let the whole thing stay buried. But then her fingers caught something, a thread, just barely visible, where she'd stitched a patch inside the boot for years ago. A call sign. Her call sign. The one they'd called her in Sangin when the shooting started and people lived or died based on what her hands could do. She closed her fist. "I'm not done," she whispered to Tom's grave. To the rain. To the woman she'd been trying to kill by becoming someone else. "I'm not done yet." The sound came first as a vibration in her chest, a low hum that didn't belong to the storm. She looked up through the rain, and there, visible through the oak leaves, was a constellation of red lights moving across the dark sky. Rotors. Multiple rotors. Close enough that she could hear the distinctive thump-thump-thump of heavy aircraft, the sound of machines built to carry men to places where they were needed. The helicopters were coming. She didn't know why. She didn't know if it was coincidence or if somehow, across the city, Captain Webb had woken up in his hospital bed and asked a question that set something in motion. She didn't know if the Navy had somehow detected the truth she'd been running from, or if this was just the universe finally catching up to her. She just knew the sound. She held Tom's boots against her chest and rose from her knees in the Savannah rain, and somewhere across the darkening sky, the helicopters were turning toward Sacred Heart Hospital. 3 of them. UH-60M Blackhawks with Night Stalker markings, the kind of aircraft that only moved when something serious was about to happen. Danielle stood in the cemetery with her husband's boots and watched them disappear behind the buildings of the city, and for the first time in 4 years, she didn't feel like she was invisible. The rotor wash shook the parking lot windows at 6:13 a.m. 2 UH-60M Blackhawks descended through the Savannah fog like judgment itself, their Night Stalker markings visible even through the mist. Danielle was still in the cemetery, holding Tom's combat boots, when her phone vibrated. A text from the hospital switchboard: "Security says military personnel requesting you by name. Active duty. They're asking for Senior Chief Ross." Her hands went still. She didn't move for 7 seconds. The boots grew heavier. Then she stood, rain-soaked scrubs clinging to her ribs, and began walking toward the hospital. Not running. Never running. That was the old part of her. The part that had learned to move with purpose, not panic. The ER lobby doors slid open and Danielle stepped through them at 6:51 a.m., still wearing the same scrubs, Tom's boots gripped in one fist at her side. The entire hospital had stopped. Nurses frozen at their stations. Residents backed against the walls. The security guards hadn't even tried to stop them. 8 figures stood in the center of the lobby. Black tactical uniforms. Plate carriers bearing the insignia of SEAL Team 3. The team leader was a lieutenant commander with shoulders like a defensive lineman and eyes that had seen things most people only had nightmares about. He looked directly at Danielle. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. It wasn't a question. "That's me." Her voice didn't waver. It had learned not to. For years of practice, and it came out steady as a surgical laser. Then her son stepped forward from behind the SEAL team. He was 26, 6'2", wearing the dress uniform of an ensign in the United States Navy, and his voice broke exactly once when he spoke. "Mom. Senior Chief. Captain Webb told them where you were." The lobby went airless. Every monitor in the facility seemed to beep at once. A nurse, the same trembling nurse who had avoided her in the break room for the past week, pulled Captain Webb's file from the rack and began reading aloud, her voice shaking so badly she had to grip the counter to steady herself. Patient admitted with crush injury sustained in motor vehicle collision. Tension pneumothorax. Severe orbital trauma with bilateral vision loss. Treatment records indicate. She looked up, directly at Danielle. Indicate that Senior Chief Ross performed emergency needle decompression at the second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She placed the 14-gauge angiocath. She brought his O2 sat from 62 to 91 in 4 minutes. The trauma surgeon's note says, if that procedure hadn't been done in the first 3 minutes, this patient would not have survived to reach the OR. The nurse kept reading. Records of Danielle's first shift at Sacred Heart. Captain Webb arriving in that EV vehicle collision. A note from 8 years prior, during their deployment together in Sangin. A commendation she'd never even told her own son about. She saved his life twice, the nurse whispered. Once in Sangin. Once here. Captain Webb stepped forward then, and Danielle's breath caught because his eyes were open. Not bandaged. Not swollen. Open and tracking movement and fixed on her with a clarity that should not have been possible. The emergency surgery. The one Danielle had made happen by refusing to accept that 7 different doctors, Sterling and 6 specialists called in on his favors, could justify leaving a man to deteriorate. The SEAL commander's voice filled the lobby like a radio transmission cutting through static. During Operation Enduring Freedom, 2013 to 2016, Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Marie Ross completed 3 operational deployments with Naval Special Warfare Group 3. She earned a Bronze Star for valor. He paused. Every eye in the hospital moved to her. A Silver Star for exceptional heroism. Another pause. Danielle's jaw tightened once. 2 Purple Hearts for wounds sustained in combat. The commander continued, voice steady and authoritative. And a Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism under fire. She's the only woman in her command to hold that decoration. Dr. Sterling had gone the color of old concrete. A 2-star admiral in dress blues walked through the ER doors at 6:58 a.m. He moved past Sterling without acknowledgement, didn't even glance at him, and crossed directly to Danielle. His arms came around her in an embrace that lasted 3 seconds, and when he stepped back, his voice was the sound of a door closing. Dr. Sterling, you are terminated effective immediately. Federal investigators have been briefed on your insurance fraud scheme. The details of your billing practices over the past 18 months have been compiled by the Department of Defense. You are no longer employed by this hospital. Sterling's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. The Admiral continued, FBI agents are here to facilitate your transition off the premises. 2 agents in dark suits and FBI windbreakers came through the doors. They didn't say anything. They just waited. Sterling looked around the lobby, at the nurses, the residents, the security guards, at Captain Webb standing with restored sight, at a Navy SEAL team in tactical gear standing beside a woman in soaking wet scrubs who had somehow been a decorated warrior all along. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. His hands were shaking. His breathing was ragged. One of the agents stepped forward. Dr. Marcus Sterling, you're being placed under federal custody pending arraignment. You have the right to remain silent. Sterling's face went slack. He looked at Danielle one last time, really looked at her, like he was seeing her for the first time, and something in him broke. His knees buckled. One of the agents caught his arm, not gently, and Sterling began to cry. Not the crying of a man expressing emotion. The crying of a man watching his entire world collapse in real time. Every phone camera in the hospital was recording. The agent steered him toward the ER doors. Sterling stumbled, caught his foot on the tile line, and nearly fell. One of the nurses, the one who had written his prescriptions, who had laughed at his jokes, who had been careful to avoid any suggestion of impropriety, watched him pass without moving. The other staff parted like water. Handcuffs clicked. A police cruiser was waiting outside, its lights silent and still. Sterling went into the back seat like a man being loaded into a hearse. The doors closed. 6 months later, on a stage at Naval Base Kings Bay, Secretary of the Navy Patricia Foley stood facing Danielle in dress whites, the uniform she had worn for the last time before she'd buried her rank and her name and everything she was. The ceremony was being broadcast to every major news outlet. Cameras everywhere. Naval officers in formal dress. Distinguished guests. The Secretary of the Navy pinned Danielle's new insignia, the rank of captain, above her left breast pocket, and when she stepped back, Danielle's son was there with his hand on her shoulder, and Captain Webb stood to his left, his eyes tracking perfectly, and behind them both was Tom's pair of worn combat boots, bronzed and polished and mounted on a wooden plinth. Tom had carried those boots through Sangin, through Helmand Province, through 3 rotations that had nearly broken him before the IED finally did. Danielle had kept them in a locker for 4 years. Never wore them. Never showed them. Just held onto them in the dark. Now they were mounted on that stage in sunlight, a testament to something she couldn't quite name. That you could honor the past without being buried by it. That you could be both a woman kneeling at a grave and a warrior standing in dress whites. That sometimes the quietest person in the room was the one holding everything together. 3 months after that, a photograph circulated on social media. It showed a man in a gray polo shirt at a folding table outside a strip mall in Tucson, Arizona. The table had stacks of insurance brochures. His name tag read, Steve. His hair had gone partially gray. His hand shook when someone called him doctor. He flinched. Every time. He was selling supplemental health insurance policies now. $40 a week. Commission only. The photo was captioned, former emergency director sentenced to 14 years federal prison for Medicare fraud, currently serving community sentences. Sterling once directed the trauma department at Sacred Heart Hospital in Savannah. Patient outcome data improved 34% under new leadership. That was the only reference to what had happened. The hospital had moved on. The scandal had been contained. The VA partnership program had been expanded. 3 new beds in the trauma wing were dedicated to uninsured veterans. Danielle was back in scrubs by her 3rd week as captain. She'd been offered the chief of trauma position. She'd turned it down. Offered the director role. Turned that down too. She wanted to be here, in the ER, with her hands on patients, with her body between people and the darkness. The promotion was on her record now. She could go anywhere. Run any department. She'd chosen instead to stay exactly where she'd been, checking vitals, drawing blood, holding the line. A young resident came into the break room where she was reviewing charts. Senior Chief? Captain Webb is in curtain 4. Says he specifically requested you. She nodded. Stood. The resident watched her move toward the door and said, very quietly, thank you. For not leaving. I was never leaving, Danielle said. I just needed people to know I was here. Captain Webb was sitting up when she entered the room. 6 months post-recovery. His vision had stabilized at 20/15ths in his left eye, 20/20ths in his right. He'd re-enlisted. Was shipping out in 8 weeks for a desk job at Naval Operations Command. He smiled when she walked in. Senior Chief. Captain. She checked his wound site, the surgical scar that ran from his ribs toward his sternum. Healed clean. No infection. The kind of healing that only happened when someone had intervened at exactly the right moment, pushed through obstacles, refused to accept that 7 doctors saying no meant anything. My daughter wanted me to tell you something, Captain Webb said. She's applying to nursing school. Said if you could go for years invisible and still save lives, she figured she could handle organic chemistry. Danielle's hand stilled. For 1 second. 2. Then she completed the examination and stepped back. Tell her the hard part isn't the chemistry. It's holding onto yourself while you're helping everyone else. Make sure she knows the difference. I will. As she turned to leave, his voice stopped her. You never told us you were there. In Sangin. In that village. We always wondered who'd stabilized Petty Officer Marcus before the medevac arrived. We'd never forget someone like that. Turns out. He paused. Turns out we just didn't recognize her without the uniform. That night, at Tom's grave, Danielle left the bronzed boots behind. They belonged in sunlight now. The ceramic tile on the headstone was cool under her palm. Rain wasn't falling. The cemetery was quiet in a way that meant something had finally settled. "I'm still here," she whispered. Just not hiding anymore. The trembling wasn't fear. The trembling was restraint. Everything she'd held in for 4 years, still burning under the surface, still moving through her hands when she held a patient and steadied them and brought them back from the edge. That was her rank now. Not captain. Not senior chief. Just the woman who understood what it meant to save someone, and how little the rest mattered. If you're watching this and you've ever seen corruption in healthcare, in the military, in any system that's supposed to protect people, report it. Truly. Use proper channels. Contact the VA's Office of Inspector General. Report to your state medical board. Call the Federal Fraud Hotline. The truth doesn't always move fast, but it moves. And people like Captain Webb, like the veterans waiting in ER lobbies, like every nurse standing over that patient at midnight wondering if anyone's listening, they're depending on you to be loud about it. What would you do if you had to choose between staying invisible and speaking up? Like and subscribe if you believe nurses deserve more respect. And tell me honestly, what would you have done in her shoes? I'm pinning the best answer.